All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to discuss long-term athlete development and youth resistance training. So we're basically going to start in the beginning with discussing what long-term athlete development is, and we're going to find out what stages athletes go through in the age continuum. And then following that, we'll talk about what types of training would be best at certain times during their developing years. And so really what we're going to try and cover today is from the time you're born until about the time that you graduate from high school, what types of training should you do and when should you implement them? Because not everything is applicable at all times. And sometimes we want to save certain types of training for later because it seems to work better. So with that in mind, let's look at what we're going to cover tonight. Maybe. There we go. So first, we're going to start off with what is long-term athlete development and what sort of issues can it address and why we would actually care about long-term athlete development. Then we'll briefly discuss the stages of growth and development. I'll skip over the end ones, which are the ones from when you graduate high school until you become a professional athlete. And then we'll discuss resistance training strategies for each of those early developing years, starting at birth and working up until we get to 18. So what is long-term athlete development? Well, it's a planned and systemic progressive development of an individual athlete throughout the lifespan. And so what this fancy definition means is we are planning the development of this athlete from when they are a young child all the way up until they compete in competitive sport, whatever that sport may be. And by providing the right type of training early on, we set them up for success at a later time. And what we're shooting for is long-term performance success, not rapid success at your given age, because we all know of athletes who have succeeded very early on, but then things didn't really work out in the end and their competitors passed them up. They didn't make it to the advanced levels of sport. So what we're really trying to do here is set athletes up for a lifetime of success. We're going to try and prepare them and build them up so they can get to the highest performance levels within their genetic ceiling. So if athletes have the ability to be very good, we want to take them all the way up, allow them to remain injury free, and we want to maximize their performance at the right time, which for most sports is between the ages of 18 and 30 years old. And with that in mind, we want to build them up to that time period and set them up for success. So you may be wondering why we're even talking about long-term athlete development or whether it's even important at this time. Well, what we find is that younger athletes, especially in this current time, they overcompete and undertrain, which means they might play multiple sports, or sometimes they're in the same sport and they're playing multiple leagues. So they have their high school team, and then they might have a regional travel team, and then they might play on some Olympic developmental team, and they're playing and competing all the time. And it's removing time and energy from when they should be developing physical skills. Often there are individuals who design training for younger athletes with sports specialization in mind. And so what they guarantee is that I'll get your kid a shot at a scholarship. We're going to get people to look at your kid. Scouts are going to come find them, and they try and give them advanced programs for older athletes, but that individual is not developed enough to gain success from that program. So those are things we want to shy away from. As we'll learn in a little bit, you being good when you're 9 years old doesn't guarantee that you'll be good when you're 18 at that given sport, because many things occur between those time periods. And just because you're the best baseball player in your 8th grade class doesn't mean that you're going to get a college scholarship for baseball. And this can be difficult sometimes to explain to parents who want their kids to be immediately good. Many programs don't take individual differences into account, and this is really important as kids age, because even at the same chronological age, two 12-year-olds, they can have quite different maturation levels. This bullet point's really important, and probably the hardest part about working with kids is sometimes the parents don't always know what's best for their individual child. They think they might have the next Wayne Gretzky, but that might not happen. They want them to play in the NFL. Kid's only going to be 5'2" or 5'3". It's time to maybe find a different sport that they can excel in. Long-term athlete development becomes very critical for volunteer coaches who are typically found at lower levels of development. So they work with middle school, elementary school teams. This is actually where we need the best coaches. And so long-term athlete development education is critical because the best coaches are often found at the highest levels, but we actually need education for the low-level coaches because those years are critical in the development and long-term success of athletes. If we follow this plan correctly, we can actually use it for talent identification, because there are many sports that kids don't even get exposed to that they could be good at, because most people are funneled into the large American sports systems. But there are plenty of other sports where people might be very successful and rise up through the ranks. They just need to be exposed to it and have a wide variety of skills. And what we're trying to avoid with long-term athlete development is early specialization, and we want to focus on long-term domination, making really good athletes later on. And in an interesting study, they found that single sport athletes typically reach lower levels of elite sport than multi-sport athletes, or athletes that played many different competitive disciplines throughout their formative years. So briefly, we're going to touch on these 9 phases. Now, we're not going to go through all of them in detail. I'm really going to stick to the first 4 or 5 here for youth resistance training. And it should be known that I did not make up any of these phases. This all comes from long-term athlete development that was essentially developed and created for the Canadian sports system by a researcher named Istvan Balye. So he basically came up with this, introduced it to Canadian sport, and this is how they run through all their stages. Now, each of these stages lines up with your chronological and training age. So basically what year you start training, how old you are, and what's going on at each individual stage in time. So you can see this is Canada Athletics. This is their periodization plan over time. And then this is how they can basically break the training phases down across a lifetime instead of just across a year. And so what we find is that many skills are introduced at different times because some of them are more appropriate than others. So in the very early part of training, really from the ages of 1 or 2 up until 10, we're focusing on physical literacy. And then from 10 to 20, we're working on more sport specific skills. And we need to have a nice solid base before we can build on it. And the wider the base you can build, the higher your pyramid can go, and ultimately the higher your success in sport. So by knowing these different phases, we can then consider what we're going to do at different times. So on the graph you see on the left, this is for female athletes, and the one on the right is for male athletes because they mature at slightly different rates. And we can see at certain times what types of training should be introduced, and then at later times what we can emphasize there. So you see these different skills and different physical qualities, and when you should focus on them. So the darker blue is when you focus on those, the lighter blue is at the earlier years. And this lines up with going through puberty for all of these kids. So it gives you a pretty nice example of what you would want to work on, a multi-year training plan. All of these plans that they've developed are all built upon this theoretical development of athletes. And so what we find is that early in life, your nervous system develops very quickly. And because of that, you can learn new things at a rapid rate. And so this is why they often want kids to learn new languages when they're very young. But we can extrapolate this out and we can ask kids to try and learn a wide variety of motor skills. The second big factor that develops is going to be your muscle fiber typing, which starts to develop until you go through puberty. So for most kids, until they're in their early teens, their muscle fiber type is undifferentiated or just beginning to start. So no sport works the best for them yet. We might as well give them a wide variety of skills. Then in late puberty and late adulthood, when your systemic hormones kick in, we can shift our training to a more traditional route, because at that time, our fiber types have differentiated. We have laid down the hormonal profile, and we can get into our normal and more advanced type training at the later time. So that early time window, we don't want to focus as much on traditional training as we want to focus on play and motor skill acquisition. And we're going to talk about physical literacy in a few slides. The other big factor that we'll talk about is if you've ever been around kids or worked with kids, they typically go through a growth spurt. And during this growth spurt time, certain types of training need to be de-emphasized, because when you're growing very rapidly, it puts quite a bit of stress on the body. And so we can measure when this growth spurt occurs by measuring your peak height velocity, which is the speed at which you grow. And during this time, when there's a lot of stress on the bones, tendons, and ligaments, certain types of training should be de-emphasized at that time, and others should be reintroduced. The other good factor is that in about a year following peak height velocity, we reach our peak strength, and a more formalized resistance training plan can occur. And so by measuring peak height velocity and knowing the following adaptations that occur after, it lets us know when we can begin to transition our athlete to a more standard and traditional strength training plan. All right, now we'll do a brief talk about the stages in the long-term athlete development model. And these all line up with that first slide I showed you with the 9 stages. And we're going to briefly go through these. So first stage begins from when you're born until you're about 6. And this is called an active start. And what we're trying to do here is just get kids moving and get them interested in play and games. And at this time, there is no formal training. It's just play through various activities, interacting with other kids to build up social skills, and then just letting kids do what kids do: run around, jump, throw things, manipulating the environment, kicking, all those basic skills that kids may need. And we're just trying to see that they're developing normal motor coordination at this time. If you did want to get them involved in some sort of scheduled activity, swimming is a really good idea at this time, because when little kids are in the pool, they typically have a little bit less muscle mass, more adipose tissue, so it's easier for them to move around in the pool because of the buoyancy. Other good options, if you do want to get them involved in some activity class, tumbling classes offered at a gymnastics facility are great options because they keep them fun, and they get a little bit of vestibular training, a little bit of motor skill coordination from controlling their body in time and space. So if you did want to do any classes, those are viable, but there's really no formal training. There's 1% instruction and then 99% play, and the rest is just herding cats, trying to keep the kids engaged the whole time. Second stage here, this is ages about 6 to 9 for males and females. And this is called the fundamental stage. And here we're integrating some practice, but most of it's play. And the biggest thing is we're trying to make it fun. And here is where our physical literacy window begins. And from the ages of about 6 to 12, we have a critical physical literacy window where you want to expose the kids to as many motor skills as possible, because this is the time when they can learn them the best. We're not saying that you couldn't try and learn them later on, but there is some evidence that if you don't learn all the fundamental motor skills at this time, you may not learn them as well as you could. So we want to introduce them during this time window. And so for this first one, the 6 to 9, we really want to focus on agility, balance, and then building upon all the skills that we started in the active start. So running, jumping, throwing, kicking, climbing, all of those are great options for this time. Usually we build them in terms of games. So there's no fundamental practice. It might be 10% instruction and then 90% fun as we build out across the session. You might start saying, hey, throw this at a target, or run and jump over this, and the rest is just have fun and get moving and keep them engaged the whole time. But disguised within that is going to be those skills that you want them to master and develop. Stage 3, this is when they're learning to train, is what they define it. And this is the second portion of the physical literacy window. There is a little bit of talent identification at this stage, because we start to see what kids have a predilection for, what they're interested in, maybe a little bit on their growth, and we might find out where some of their early talents lie. And for certain sports, you need to specialize early. Mainly gymnastics is the one we would consider here. Upon the skills that you built in the first physical literacy stage, we want to build upon them. And you want to expand them out to make more complex motor skills, linking skills together, getting a little bit faster, working on sprinting. Anaerobic development is great here. And you're really working on a wide base of physical skills to capitalize on. It would also be a really good time to have the kids try out multiple sports, play 3-4 sports a year, give things a try. They want to play with their friends. It wouldn't limit them on any individual training at this time. And then, as we'll discover, this is when we start to do some basic resistance training exercise. Really, body weight exercises get introduced here at this stage. The next stage here, stage 4, is training to train. This is where you go into a more formal training plan. This is when kids are starting to go through puberty, both males and females. And now we can start to focus on more complex motor skills, such as endurance, strength, and speed. You're additionally going to start refining down your sport-specific skills, depending on what individual sport you're beginning to emerge and be good at. We still want you to play multiple sports, but you might be starting to figure out that you're better at one than another, and you may be beginning to put a little more effort into that individual sport or types of sports. You might notice that you're more of an endurance athlete or a strength and power athlete based on your fiber typing. You usually learn pretty quickly. Really critical during this window for stage 4 is that this is when peak height velocity occurs. And there might be a small loss of motor coordination at this time because of the rapid growth rate. And so you do need to be careful, because landing mechanics can be critical. They might lose some movement skill patterns because they've grown so quickly. But once you get out of this phase, typically 12 to 18 months after, this is when your formal weight training can begin, your more standard type resistance training plan. Additionally, the amount of time you're competing and the amount of time that you're training should be balanced. We shouldn't be only focused on competition, even though this is a lot of times when those sport specialization schools try and poach the athletes and then push them into a certain sport. Unless you're really in a sport that's dominated by a young age, such as gymnastics, you should still be encouraging multiple sports and playing multiple seasons, a different sport during different times, to try and offset any of the overuse injuries that occur from early specialization. This is the last stage that we'll cover today. This is the learning to compete stage. This is typically the athletes later in high school, anywhere from sophomore to senior years. And here's when you begin to specialize in individual sports. And you really focus on sport specific preparation. Typically by your senior year, you know what sport you excel in, and you begin putting your energy into that sport. Doesn't mean you won't play multiple sports still at this time, but you have a pretty good idea of scouts looking at you for individual sports and where you might be heading in terms of college offers and where you might be putting most of your effort. And so at this time is really when we want to introduce our periodized training plans. And we need to be able to emphasize and de-emphasize certain types of training at the right time. So we have different types of sports. You might, in the American system, you might play football, you might wrestle, and in the spring you might play baseball. And so therefore the training plan that goes along with that year needs to be catered for each of those individual sports. And you might focus on strength, power, speed, and endurance at different times of the year to help multilateral development to fit in with all those sports. Just briefly, we're going to talk about these last stages, but we're not going to go in depth. Stage 6 is your training to compete. This is when you're in college, and this is when you actually specialize in one sport. There are some athletes that can play 2 sports in college, but it's pretty rare. So here's where you get a college scholarship and you specialize, and you're really working on competition specific tactics and your mental preparation here to execute at the top level, trying to win those national championships, win your conference. And so this is one of the later stages for most athletes. Most good athletes will end here, have a good college career, and then they'll transition into stage 9, which is active for life, where you retire after your Division I. Now, your last 2 stages, this is when, if you're a very good athlete, you may pursue a professional career, starting anywhere from 20 to 23. This is your last couple years of college, and depending on your sport, you may be able to carry them to the professional level. And then that's really where you're only focusing on maximizing performance and competing. And then winning for a living is if you're lucky enough to be a professional athlete. You try and ride that wave for as long as you can. Maybe you're lucky enough to be a Tom Brady and playing football until you're 40. But most people, this stage will end in their mid to late 20s, possibly early 30s, and you transition to active for life in the retirement stage. So really what we're going to cover at the end here is just going to be those first 5 stages and what we would do. So right now, does anyone have any questions on long-term athlete development and the stages that I went over before I go forward? I see I have some of my students in here, so I didn't bore them to death in class and they came in. All right. So now what we're going to cover is actually the main topic for tonight, which is going to be the resistance training for these different time periods. So our active start phase, this was our kids from birth to about 6 years. There is no resistance training in this time period, no formalized resistance training. The only thing that they're going to encounter that would be a form of resistance training is going to be controlling their own body weight. And so, as we mentioned earlier, gymnastics and swimming are good options here. There is some early organized activity that kids can be involved in. And so, especially gymnastics in the US has a pretty good history of talent identification and building up plans through the TOPS program. And so for certain kids, they might have that predilection for gymnastics. And this is a good time to see if they have interest. And usually those programs know how to weed out the kids pretty early. We don't have any formalized skill. It's 100% fun in play and interacting with other kids. The best thing you can do is go outside and play. Go to a playground, run around, and do all the activities that kids do. Give them a wide variety of activities. Try and find places to take kids that have many different types of scenarios, climbing, Monkey bars obviously make it safe on the playground, and you just want them to be engaged and make it purposeful and try and get them to engage in moving around. That's basically all we're doing now. And you're getting the kids to just know how they move in time and space. And you can see how they're developing. Can they control their limbs? Can they cut and change direction very quickly? Can they jump off things and land under control? And basically, we're just letting little kids play. So no formalized resistance training yet. All right, 6 to 9. This is our early phase of the physical literacy window. This is where we want kids to go through more motor skill preparation. We want them to do all the skills that we mentioned earlier. So at this time, tumbling classes, teaching them how to roll, climb, manipulate their body weight. We want them kicking objects like soccer balls, kicking a rugby ball, throwing baseballs, dodgeballs. Any of that is great for kids. Basically, any motor skill that you can think of, we want to introduce them to. And so at this time, it's really body weight exercises, teaching them how to get on and up and down off the floor, how to jump over objects, climb over objects, how to manipulate things and throw them. Those are all really good choices at this time. Because we want it to be fun, we try and hide fundamental movement skills in other activities. So if we want to teach a kid to run at this time, we could have them do 5 sets of 10 sprints, and then the kid would be bored out of his mind and not paying attention. Or we could get a giant parachute, have all the kids hold it, throw it up the air, and then make the kids run across underneath the parachute before it lands on the ground. So we're hiding activities within this context. We want to teach them to throw. Maybe we set up an obstacle course and we tell them to knock something over with a dodgeball. The kids think it's fun. It gives them an outcome, but we're working on hand-eye coordination, spatial awareness, and then throwing at the same time. We could do the same thing with kicking. So we want to challenge the athlete. We don't want to make it so challenging that they become disinterested. Most of it, it's going to be 90% fun and 10% instruction. That instruction is hidden within the skill you're trying to develop. And we always want to keep them engaged and end on a positive note. You always want the kids to end and be happy, so they'll come back again at a later time. And there should be no skills off the table at this time. As many as you can think of, anything you want to do, give it to the kids. The more practice and more environmental stimulus, the better. So great options here during this time are some of the things they call animal patterns. You have crab walking, bear walking, you make it up. Kids think it's fun to try and act like an animal. Build those in. They're manipulating their body weight. So when we think about resistance training at this time, that's a great form. We try and make it fun. And you can set up environments and try and make obstacle courses that have little skills built in. So hopping over objects, working on teamwork and cooperation, building out drills between teams, make a little relay race. This is fun. I included this office meme here for parkour. Give kids objectives to try and jump over. So build a mini obstacle course, have them run through, and build in about 10 motor skills, and then let them run through as many times as they want. Keeps the kids active, works on multiple motor skills, and they think it's fun, and you're secretly training them to be athletes better at a later time. Ages 9 through 12, this is going to be our second physical literacy window. So after we've introduced many of the motor skills, we're going to build them up and make them a little bit better through more formalized training. So where we were at maybe 90-10, maybe we're now at 20-80 at this time. We're giving them some instruction, but still spending a majority of the time having fun instead of practicing. Now, here's where some resistance training may come in, especially in the later years when you're like 10, 11, and 12. We can do machine-based training if the equipment is of the right size for the kids. We can start to integrate in lightweight implements. So on the picture you see here, you have a formalized weightlifting bar, which is 45 pounds. You can buy school age and youth bars starting at 5 pounds, and increase them up as you go. So a school age bar starts at 5, 10, and 15 pounds. And then you see a picture of these big weights on the bottom. It allows the kids to put the weight in the position, but it doesn't weigh very much. So they can feel like they're lifting a lot, but it's really only 5 or 10 pounds. So you increase the weight as the kids can handle it. You want to scale to size. Remember, these are not small adults, and they need to be able to grip and grasp the items in a secure manner. We want to start very simple with these kids, especially when it comes to resistance training exercises, and then build up until the end of this phase. So in the beginning, we might give them a PVC pipe and teach them how to lift with a PVC pipe. Do that for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we let them run around. As the more formalized instruction comes in, we build up to very light barbells. We're teaching them the skills of lifting and training. Especially in this phase, we want to start to introduce landing mechanics and teaching kids how to land effectively. And you can do some low-level plyometrics like double leg hopping, jumping over small implements are all great for kids. The other thing we're going to do here is basically introduce weight room etiquette and knowledge. It's a little bit about safety, but also how you handle yourself in a weight room. Obviously, this age, kids are not that mature, and you can slowly integrate in how the weight room is supposed to be run, and then the knowledge of what occurs in the weight room. It's not too formal, but you start to introduce that the weight room is a place for safety and training, and then we save a lot of the play for outside on the field and other areas. So what do we focus on here with the lightweight exercises? Here we're doing full range of motion exercises, whether it be machines or free weights. We are emphasizing and we are encouraging form instead of weight. So if you want to set up a little competition, whoever lifts the weight with the best technique wins, not the person that lifts the most amount of weight. And so at this time, if you have perfect technique, that should be rewarded over going heavy. If you're doing any formal resistance training, especially in that 11 to 12 age range, you want to do multiple repetitions, typically 8 to 15 reps. We're not lifting heavy. We are not maxing out at this time. You want to just focus on proper execution and many repetitions. There's plenty of time later to lift heavy. It's important to know that kids will get very strong at this time, but that strength disappears rapidly because all of the strength that they build is typically neural in nature because they're not gone through puberty yet. And so what this means is you want to have a long-term and consistent plan in place that lets them continue training, because what will happen is they'll come in for a few weeks, they might go into a sports season, and then they come back and you realize they're right at zero where they started. And that's because all these gains go right back to normal due to neural processes. So it's better to have maybe just 1 or 2 training sessions for most of the year than a really formalized plan and then drop it out when other seasons come in. So you want to build it in conjunction with the other type of sports that they're playing and participating in at this time. Ages 12 to 16, here's your formal resistance training. This is right in and around the peak height velocity. This is when we can start to do full barbell lifting, dumbbells, and a more standard resistance training plan. We're still focusing on perfect technique across multiple repetitions, but we can bring the repetitions down a little bit. So anywhere from 6 to 12, 6 to 15 is good. But you want to conservatively load and build athletes up over time. And the good motto is soon ripe, soon rotten. So just because an athlete can go very heavy doesn't mean we should go heavy. It's better to leave a few repetitions in the tank during this time because we can always access it later. We don't want to push them too hard, risk an injury when the weight room is supplemental to their main sport. We're really focusing on general physical preparation at this time. So you're doing a wide variety of exercises, training all body systems. And here we're going to start developing the training environment and respect for the training process, explaining to them why they're doing it and then what it's like in the gym. During this time, you want to be aware of peak height velocity because it puts a great strain on tendons, ligaments, and it might cause general growing pains. And if that's the case, we want to de-emphasize some of the stuff we do in the weight room. Remember during this time that they're growing very quickly, nutrition is important because not only do they need nutrition for growing, but then they need nutrition for recovering from the training you're doing. So we don't want to overtax kids. We want to make sure they're eating fully. There may be a small drop in neuromotor control during peak height velocity. It comes back very quickly. They just become a little bit less uncoordinated, and there might be some landing mechanic issues. And you might want to focus on balance, coordination, and stability of joint segments at this time, as opposed to really complex high-speed motor skills. And this time is when we start to implement a periodized training plan built around all the sports seasons. So if you remember, at this time, we want to be playing 3 or more sports, and you'll want to periodize the training that you do in the gym in and around their 3 sports seasons so that you can emphasize whatever general training they need to be good at the sport at that given time. Our last phase here, this is late high school. This is when your sport specialization may occur, and what you do in the gym should mimic what your sport specialization is going to be. If you're a strength and power specialist, team sport athlete, or an endurance athlete, your training should mimic what you're trying to be good at. Now, most of the training is pretty general and it all looks pretty similar, but you do want to emphasize at certain times of the year, whatever specific sport they're trying to be good at, that should be mimicked in the weight room and the exercises that you choose. If you've done everything properly up until this time, their weight room skills are well developed and there's really nothing that they can't do. They can do plyometrics, they can do weightlifting movements and derivatives, they can do major strength training exercises, medicine ball. All of these are great at this time. This might be a time to introduce some sport-specific hypertrophy as hormonal profiles have kicked in, especially in the 16 to 18 range. So you can start focusing on acquiring lean body mass and getting that sport-specific hypertrophy that you need to excel in your given sport. We have a hypertrophy focus early during the general physical preparation development, and we shift towards maximal strength and power development later in high school. And then we try and align our speed and acceleration training to work at game speed later in the time when their sports season occurs. And so this kind of goes into that periodized model that you've developed, so you know when to emphasize and de-emphasize certain physical training qualities. So I talked a little bit longer than I thought. I'm going to open it up to questions now from everybody that's on the call. So what questions do you have about these models that I talked about?
Hey, Dr. Haber, just a quick question about PHV. Are there easy ways for kind of the layperson to identify where somebody is, like an athlete is kind of pre-PHV or post-PHV? Are there certain things that you look for?
So it's pretty easy to measure. You just have to keep taking the height measurements, and then there are free online calculators that you can type in the measurements for height, and it will tell you when they're approaching peak height velocity, when they're in it, and when it has ended. So you can look those up. The free ones, you can just type it straight in there, and then by systematically measuring height with the athletes, you'll get an easy reading of when that occurs.
Excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Chris, that was awesome. I have a question also.
Okay.
So, all this stuff, and this is an area that's been of interest to me. So, I mean, the first class I learned how to coach was 6 to 9 year olds, and based totally on this. But one thing we always run into, like we have these grand visions of creating this year-long and multi-year programs for youth athletes. Being in, where we are geographically, Fairfield County, Connecticut. I think most of the coaches that are on are from the area. I've been in other areas where it's super competitive from a parent and youth coach standpoint.
Yep.
Like, how do you balance that, and how do you try to implement a lot of this practically versus just theoretically on paper?
So when you get the kids in, it's important to instruct the parents as well, because they're often the ones that are, they're the kids' ride to practice, and they're taking them to different games and sports. And so often it's giving the education component to the parents and saying where your kid is right now, from the 6 to 9 or 6 to 12 age range. This is the formative period of time when we're trying to set them up to make them the best later on. And so, though there are people telling you that you need to specialize now to make it, it's actually the exact opposite, where if we can specialize a little bit later, the athletes will actually do better. And there's pretty clear evidence that you can pull and show them that most collegiate athletes were multi-sport athletes throughout their developmental career for most sports. Now, you can always pull out individual arguments against this, but it really comes down to explaining that consistent, well thought out, and well planned training will result in the kids achieving a higher performance level, but also not getting injured along the way from overuse injuries, and why specializing at such a young age may actually prevent them from reaching their highest level. And usually when you explain it to the parents that way, that you don't want to limit their development by doing things too early, usually it kind of opens their eyes up to realize what your long-term plan is.
Awesome. And I've got a question in the chat here from Eric. How do you structure microcycles at the 16 to 18 year old developmentally, and what types of step loading do you like to utilize?
So I don't structure the training any differently at the 16 to 18 age. So I'll still use your typical paradigms where you can use block periodization, a 3-up, 1-down cycle, 3 weeks of loading, 1 week off. The only difference is, as long as you've had that general physical preparation stage before, you're starting to shift to more training phases where you're focusing on maximal strength development that's built upon hypertrophy. And then in the end, like 17 to 18, you can focus on power development. So you don't really have to change any of your paradigms during that age. We try to be more conservative when they're younger. So that 12 to 16 age, that's when we build up much slower, and we're very conservative with the loading. So our training plans might look longer, and you're building across 12 to 16 weeks because you're starting at a much lower level and doing much higher repetitions at lower intensities.
Thank you so much, Tabor. That makes sense.
Awesome. Any other questions out there? No. Dr. Tabor, thanks so much. And I messed up. I didn't even give a proper intro for you at the beginning. For those that don't already know, Dr. Tabor is our PhD in strength conditioning specialist within the exercise science faculty. Does a lot of research in the field, and is a great resource to have for any topic related to strength and conditioning, but this was a great one. All right, if nobody has anything else, I'll stop recording.